this event with opening remarks. Alexandra, please, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon to some. My name is Alexandra Maloney. I'm currently the BPI president. So thank each of you for joining here with our illustrious panelists for today on this topic of supporting African-American entrepreneurship. So it's right on the cusp, coming off of UNGA. The U.S. Black Chambers of Commerce has an upcoming program towards the end of the month, a large conference, and the U.S. Africa Summit that's coming in December. And so I think that this is a very timely discussion. So thank you to Cal Williams, Colo Fellow, and the Business and Economic Committee for putting this webinar on. And for those who are here who have not explored membership with BPIA, we encourage you to do so. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Colo Fellow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for those opening remarks. So we're just going to go straight into it. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. And welcome to the second of our 6th series virtual fora on supporting African-American entrepreneurship. My name is Kulu Kugler, and I'm co-chair of Business and Economic Development Committee of BPIA. My fellow co-chair, Suli Kenyatta, joins me in welcoming you to today's webinar. We hosted the first webinar in June, where we had a wonderful panel and excellent audience participation. We thank you for your continued support, and we are confident that this webinar will be as informative and dynamic. The first webinar focused on resources to support African-American entrepreneurs in the US. This one will address investment and trade opportunities between African-American and African enterprises. We hope that this webinar highlights the opportunities for African-American entrepreneurs to do business with a market of over 1 billion people and a growing middle class, and opportunities for African entrepreneurs to access a market with a 300 billion potential and an ever-growing preference to buy Black. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists who will delve into these issues in more detail. I will introduce them in the order that they will address us today. The first is Professor Landry Singh, PhD. He is Executive Director and Professor of Thunderbird School of Global Management in DC and Senior Fellow of Brookings Institution. He will give us a macroeconomic perspective on African countries, highlighting some economic superstars on the continent and build the case for doing business and with Africa. Our second panelist will be Florie Lizer. She's the President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa and former Assistant US Trade Representative for Africa. She will share with us some of CCA's activities and experiences in doing business in Africa. Our third panelist is Sean Walker. He is the co-founder of Royal Hairstyles Training Academy and Salon in Johannesburg, South Africa, and a former banker at Citibank, New York, who's been living in South Africa for about 14 years. He will share his experiences as an African-American entrepreneur in Africa. And last, and certainly not least, is Latana Amina Okpukpara. She is the founder and principal director of Mina Stores Company in Abuja, Nigeria, and an engineer by training. Amina will talk about her business that sources gemstones sustainably. She has created and is expanding export links between her business in Nigeria and the US. We have circulated the impressive bios beforehand, and they remain available on the event webpage for your perusal. The first part of the webinar will be moderated by Cal Williams, who is the Vice President for Business and Economic Development of BPIA and a very fond colleague. Please enjoy the discussion that will follow, and Cal, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Colo. I must say that was an excellent presentation and introduction. I'm very proud of Colo. She has taken the lead on preparing this event, and you see how poised and confident she is. I'll turn the floor over to Landry now. As Colo said, he will set the stage for what's going on in Africa in very exciting and dynamic presentation. Landry.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Carl, Colo, and to the entire team. It is my distinguished pleasure and honor to be with you today to engage on this extremely important topic. And of course, I want to also highlight my dear friend Flory, who is a partner in engaging on critical issues related to Africa investment and trade, and the other distinguished panelists. So probably I want to speak in my brief remark about a couple of things. The first one will be some of the biggest longer term trends about trade and investment, because I think that too often people will focus on short-term perspective, which unfortunately do not necessarily capture the phenomenal potential of Africa. And probably I will conclude on a lighter note, if I can say this, by sharing some of the key points that a few points related to an article I wrote a few years ago with Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, and the title was From Wakanda to Reality, Building Mutual Prosperity Between African and African American, or between African American and Africa. So in terms of investment and of trade, so some of the key points that I want to make, of course, when engaging, quite often, people wonder if the market is ready in Africa, whether to actually actively be involved, except in some of the areas such as the food processing, among other, where we have players such as Coca-Cola. But many of you probably have read my most recent book, Unlocking Africa Business Potential. I have a second volume which will be coming on realizing the Africa economic and business potential. There are many key trends that I want to share, and I will share them briefly, and later we can expand, we can discuss further. So one of the first one is that Africa is really richer than what most people think. No matter how rich you think Africa is richer than that. So that is a key dimension to bring. And many of you know what the Economist published in 2020, in 2000, the Hopeless Africa. And then after that, they apologized. They mentioned the Hopeful Africa. But a key element, a key statistic that I want to share is that trade in and with Africa has grown 300% in the last decade. That pre-pandemic, outperforming global average. Outperforming global average. So that's the key dimension that sometimes people, the global average is about 196%. So it's a key dimension. And one of the things that I also often say when people are interested in addressing economic growth, diversification, job creation, including for young people and women, one of the best things to do is to do through investment and trade. So that was one of the key dimensions. The second dimension is, why should everyone be involved in doing business with Africa? By the end of the century, Africa will have almost 40% of the global population. So if you are not in Africa, if you are out of Africa, you will be out of reaching potentially up to 40% of the global population. And that is from 17% in 2020 and 26% in 2050. This is phenomenal. So again, thinking about the long-term perspective, long-term growth, companies which are disruptive will make a monumental difference. A third trend that I want to share also is that by 2050, the combined consumer and business spending in Africa will exceed 16.12 trillion US dollar. So more than 16.12 US dollar. And you have whether we speak about the consumer market itself, or business consumption. So for example, household consumption will include areas such as food, some of the largest area, food, beverage, housing, but also hospitality and recreation, healthcare, financial services, among other. And business spending will include construction, utility, transportation, agriculture, and agri-processing. So other key dimensions. The fourth point is really related to the rise of global partnership, but also the competition between established power and rising new powers. So, of course, we have seen, including the recent visit of Secretary of State Blinken in Africa, right after some of the dynamics with Russia and China on the continent. And here, for example, in 2009, China became the region's first trading partner in Africa. So meaning that you have that competition, which is intense, outperforming many of the historical players. So again, to think about how the US, who has better practice, can really capture, let's say, or engage in areas of competitive advantage, which are also aligned and in which African American can really play a phenomenal role. So the fifth key trend is related to, and of course, I'll be happy to expand also and to discuss the dynamic with some of the other players, Russia, but also Brazil, India, Turkey, and some of the Arab states. So the fifth trend is really the fast urbanization that we have on the continent, which will go from 5 cities of more than 10 million of more than both 10 million and 5 million to more than 17 cities, which will be incredibly highly populated. So the continent had, let's say, in 2015, about 3 cities of more than 10 million inhabitants, and then they will exceed 5 by 2030. And they had also a few years ago, a limited number of cities of more than 5 million inhabitants, and then they will also increase drastically by the end of the 2030. So the sixth trend is really the effort to bridge infrastructure gap. Of course, the pandemic is playing a key role here in reducing some of the speed of some of the investment, and the estimated gap still remain at more than $100 billion a year per recent estimate, but much more investment has been made in the past couple of decades compared to the period before. So that's also an important characteristic. So the 7th key trend that I want to share is related to the 4th industrial revolution, digital transformation, technological innovation. And here, whether we speak about artificial intelligence, or we also speak about drones and automated vehicles, among other, African leaders are, many of the African leaders are trying to lead the way. South Africa, for example, has started the Center for the 4th Industrial Revolution in partnership with the World Economic Forum. We see the same trend also with Rwanda. So there's really an opportunity here to make a monumental difference. The 8th trend here is related to the fast regional integration and the African continental free trade area. Created in 2018, ratified by 2019, officially launched in 2021, and it is the largest trade agreement per number of countries after the World Trade Organization. But also the potential of transforming African economies is simply phenomenal. And some people wonder, is there an opportunity for American companies, because the AfCFTA is about Africa? As long as American companies are investing, they will benefit in Africa. They will benefit from the same rules of origin than any other African country. So in fact, Africa could be a base for global expansion of some of the American companies. That's one dimension. And a second, more indirect dimension is by simplifying and harmonizing the ease for doing business. It will be good for any American company anywhere they are. So create a larger market. So those are some of the opportunities which could be created. And I will finish with the trends, which is related to really African citizens are also demanding more accountability. They are demanding more stability. We still have some challenges, of course. People will point out, oh, what happened in Mali, in Burkina, but or in some of the other countries. But fortunately, those are some of the few exceptions where we have those disruption by military coup, which should be further addressed also in the by the leaders. But those were some of the key trends that I really wanted to share. And I'll be happy to expand on the African-American angle later, because I know that I want to give back the time to our dear moderator. You are muted, Al.
Sorry, I was muted because I didn't want to interrupt you while you were speaking. I won't summarize. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Landry. Flory, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And again, thanks to BPIA for your leadership and, just being a link between African Americans, Blacks who are in the field of international affairs, and linking us to the continent of Africa, which is really critical. There's so many things that one could say about this. Obviously, we have a history. African Americans and Africans, our ancestry, that's how we got to be here, and across the world, the diaspora, not just in the US, but Canada, Europe, and everywhere else. But there are other links as well. So historically, I like to think about how in the 60s, there were various leaders, and before that as well, various African American leaders that played a role in African Americans being given civil rights here. And about that same time that Africans on the continent, leaders like Nkrumah and others, were pushing for African independence. And so, we share that as well. We have our ancestral ties, but we also have the ties and the bonds of fighting against oppression, fighting against racism, anti-apartheid movement, the role that African Americans here played in that. And historically, just, that bond of people of color here in the US and in the majority population on the continent, really battling to be respected, given all the rights that we have. And to the point that I focus on is being major players in the economies of our countries. We still are not. Africa today still accounts for only 2.5% of all global trade, which is ridiculous when you think how rich, all the points that Landry was making about where Africa is today, all the sectors that are doing so well there, all the natural resources and human resources that Africa has. And when you think that they have only 2.5% of global trade, African Americans also find themselves in a situation here in the US where we don't account for our share of the economy here as well. But there are some opportunities, I think, I wanted to focus on a few that really could, in some ways, support both the continent of Africa and the creation of jobs, the contribution to the economic and social well-being of the people there, with the same thing here. The way that I would focus on that is that today, a lot of the businesses in Africa, though there are many multinationals in Africa and big companies, so don't get me wrong on that, but many of Africa's businesses are small businesses. They are women-owned, youth-owned, and I think Landry touched on the youth bulge in Africa. And there are many SMEs in Africa that are really driving economic growth on the continent. Likewise, here in the US, SMEs, people don't know this, but SMEs also drive a good portion of US economic development. What happens with our GDP, even job creation, is driven by companies that have, fewer than 50 people in many cases. And so because we have Black-owned, minority-owned, African diaspora-owned businesses here in the US that have skills and expertise in key sectors, whether it's in tech, in the creative economy, health sector, energy sector, especially in renewable energy. We have businesses here like that. And then those are really, in my view, the perfect partners for small businesses on the continent. And that's not to say that there's no role for large companies here in the US to work with smaller businesses in Africa, but I'm just saying there's a special opportunity. So, a couple of key sectors I wanted to just touch on very quickly. Agribusiness. One of my pet peeves is that much of Africa's raw materials leave the continent as raw commodities, go to other places like India and Vietnam and China, and they are processed there. And what that actually means, that's the reason why Africa has only 2.5% of world trade, is because they are at the lowest end of almost every value chain there is. Every product that they have just about, whether it's diamonds or copper or cashews or cocoa or tea, often, if not most of the time, gets exported to other places in the world where investments are being made into manufacturing and processing. So one example that I talk about often, and I've seen it in Africa, so I feel like I can speak to this, is cashews. Something like 68% of Africa's cashews go to Vietnam and India and other places, but mostly Vietnam and India for processing. And there's really no reason why, Africa shipping cashews from West Africa or even East Africa or Southern Africa like Mozambique to South Asia so that people there, they have, tens of thousands of jobs that have been created in Vietnam that are processing Africa's cashews and then shipping it to the rest of the world, and as well as back to Africa. And so, that particular narrative is true across so many sectors in Africa. So to the point of opportunities, if I were a businesswoman in the sense of looking for setting up factories or exploring myself business opportunities in Africa, that's one of the places that I would look. What are the products in Africa that African Americans, women-owned, minority-owned, diaspora-owned businesses here in the US can work with Africans to help them play a larger role in these global supply chains? So whether it's, taking their cocoa beans and turning it into chocolate, or taking their, tea leaves and, or coffee beans and turning it into, products that people pay, $5 a cup for, but not in Africa, right? And making sure that Africans capture a larger share of the global economy and create the jobs and establish the manufacturing base in Africa. That's how every other country in the world has developed over the years. And this is what we need to be promoting. And I think there's a special role that we as African Americans and diaspora Africans in the US can play in that. A couple other sectors that are key, ICT. There are a lot of opportunities in Africa. The tech startups there, like off the chain, they've been attracting a lot of investment into tech. For example, venture capital in Africa is definitely on the rise. Last year, African startups raised a little less than $3 billion in venture capital funding. And that was more than triple the amount in just the previous year, in 2020. And in 2021, fintech accounted for 61% of all invested capital that was deployed to the African continent in 2021. And Kenya alone attracted more venture funding in the first 3 months of this year, 2022, $482 million than it did in all of 2021, which was $412 million. So we can see that in the ICT area, there are a lot of opportunities. And here in the US, we've got a lot of smart young people in the tech sector with the tech skills. We should be partnering with these Africans who also are at the forefront of innovation on the continent. Tech innovation is there. The creative or orange economy is another one. Movies, music, the arts, these are all vibrant sectors that are growing in Africa, especially Nigeria, Nollywood, we all know it. South Africa is another one. And we're now in the US seeing, programming on Netflix and Amazon and other stations that have African content. And, I don't know about you, but I love that. But the question is, what's the role that, African Americans can play in fostering those kinds of partnerships in the creative economy sector? Health is another one. Health sector is very important. A lot of things happened during COVID. A lot of things happened during COVID that we need to focus on. Tourism, culture, and exchange. A lot of things are happening there that we can work on. So let me just end by saying that, there are partnerships that are being developed. The US, through initiatives like the African Growth and Opportunity Act, Prosper Africa, Power Africa. There are organizations like BPIA, like CCA, and others that are promoting these partnerships between African Americans and the continent, and between the US and Africa more broadly. And again, I'm happy to share more information about it, but CCA is working closely with the White House and National Security Council.
Okay. Thank you very much, Flory.
Yeah, right.
It was a perfect lead in because Sean is actually going to address one of your key points, the small entrepreneurs in sectors such as services. Sean, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much for handing it over to me. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the audience this evening, or evening for me at least. So my background is one that is kind of circuitous to get into the personal care space. I studied finance at the University of Pennsylvania. I worked on Wall Street as an investment banker for 2 years before I moved to South Africa in 2009. I moved to South Africa with my eye towards wanting to start a business. I had a fraternity brother from undergrad who lived here for a year. He did his third year of investment banking. And he was like, hey, why don't you try to start a business in South Africa? And at the time I was 23, 24 years old. And I figured, okay, well, worst case scenario, things don't work out. I have an interesting story for a business school application, and I just moved back after a couple of years. And after my first 6 months here, I realized that it was a place I wanted to stay. I worked for an NPO called Endeavor South Africa, which at the time was focused on supporting entrepreneurs in the developing world. So South Africa was one of its subsidiaries. It had subsidiaries at the time primarily in emerging markets throughout the world. So I worked there for 3 years as the head of business development. And basically what that meant was that when we selected entrepreneurs into our portfolio, my team was in charge of helping those businesses grow. And that position gave me an opportunity to look at various sectors throughout South Africa that might be appealing to me. And long story short, I ended up deciding that the hair care industry was the most appealing, because there was an opportunity to on one hand, to build a big business, but on the other hand, also to in a way give back to the South African community through educational development. So my business, we started out focusing on the training side of the industry. So train informally operating hairdressers and people who wanted to break into the industry so that they can get the skills necessary to compete in the market. And we leveraged um, uh, that experience and building a reputation on that side of things to launch a product line. And we basically I've created a kind of a closed circuit, if you will, whereby we train people on our products, and so that they get used to the products, they like the products, and so that they buy the products. And our training is also focused not only on technical hairdressing skills, but also entrepreneurship. So we want all of our students to think entrepreneurially, whether they're working in a salon or starting their own businesses, because we believe that's the only way that they can maximize their value in the industry. So I don't want to take up too much time, but that's basically my story in a nutshell, and the story of Royal Hairstyles. I think that one of the key takeaways that I can leave you guys with in my opening remarks is having local partnerships is incredibly important. We do a lot of work with government in South Africa, and having a Black South African business partner, as I do, has been really helpful in building those relationships, because South Africans, even 25 years post-apartheid, Black South Africans especially, really struggle to become economic participants, and ensuring that we are assisting in that development is really a key focus of our business philosophically. And I think we've made some headway in that. So thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to engaging with the rest of the panelists as we move forward this evening.
Thank you very much, Sean. I think the point I would raise before passing it to Amina, partnerships are very, very important. I think, as Floyd was saying, as Landry has said, bridges that can be built and reinforced between the African continent and people of African Americans here in the United States is very, very important. So thank you very, very much for not only your opening remarks, but the example of what you're doing. Amina?
Hi, everyone. So I'll just go right into it because we don't have too much time left. I am a gemologist, ASM, I'll say advisor. I'm the principal director at Mina Stones. I'm supposed to talk about my journey and my story and hope that it will help some people, inspire people, and then also for people to see opportunities where you can do business. So Mina Stones, we started about 12 years ago when we realized there was a lot of neglect. I know some of the panelists mentioned about the opportunities that are available in Africa, but there was a lot of neglect and extreme poverty in my space. With ASM gemstone mining, many of the areas where we get the precious stones that many of you know, the sapphires, the emeralds, especially in Nigeria, they're actually found in some areas that are really poverty stricken. So when we realized this, we actually decided to do something about it. And because of this, it's become a core part of our business model. So our journey has been very long, I will say. We're still at it. There's a lot of learning and growing that has happened over the years, but we've been consistent in that learning, and we continue to learn even every day. We're known to be a pioneer, I would say, in Nigeria, especially from starting the first gemstone trade show many years back. And we have a platform where we deal with the government, the private sector, and we kind of bring everybody together to see how we can boost the gemstone sector in Africa. We work very closely with artisanal miners and small-scale miners in the field. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a social brand, and what that means is we're vertically integrated. We are involved in the entire journey of a gemstone. So our business model is really for us to be able to make long-standing impacts, and we engage in what we call project-based support and development of ASM, where we actually build people at every level in our supply chain, which ultimately improves our production and output as a company. We collaborate with many like-minded individuals and organizations globally who want to do business with us, but also want to make long-standing impacts in people's lives. So finding the right people to work with is very key for us. We have found some great partners, through connections, referrals, or networking. We try to attend key industry events so that we are able to, not just find value, but also give value. So we find a way to give value at such events as well. We've collaborated with, organizations in the US to help raise funds for artisanal miners who are actually really the key individuals in our industry supply chain. We plan to do more collaborations that are on different levels, really, that benefit all parties involved. I don't want to take too much time because really I could spend the whole day talking about what we do and our story. But the main thing I would like to dwell on is the fact that I think Flori mentioned something about processing. This is also a very big thing in the mining sector in Africa. I'll speak specifically about gemstones. We've, like I said earlier, we try to build the people in our supply chains, and we are vertically integrated, meaning that we also process. So we mine the stones, we process the stones, and we set them in jewelry as well. This is very key because exporting raw materials doesn't really do anything for anybody, not for the country, not for the continent, not for people who are doing business. So there's a huge gap there with processing. And it's something that I think many of you on this call who are looking for opportunities in Africa should really look into. It's an opportunity for not just you to make business, but for you to make impacts on the continent as well. Yeah, I don't want to take too much. I know we have little time left, so I'll just leave the rest to the question and answer, Kolo. So yeah, thank you.
Let me thank all the panelists. I won't summarize. I think a couple of points, however, I will summarize. The point that you made, Amina, that Flori stressed, adding value on the continent is key. And I think that what we need to think about, I'm talking to the audience now, is what you know and what value can you bring. Sean has given an example of taking his expertise and skills to the continent itself. We had in our first panel someone who was a Peace Corps volunteer, and she, as a result of that experience, created a shea butter industry in the country she's worked in, adding value there and giving continent and an income to the people in Africa. So let me just say this. Flori, Landry, Amina, Sean, do you have any reactions, strong reactions to what someone else has said? Comments or questions? Any one of the panelists, to the other panelists?
Let me perhaps start by saying that, by thanking the other panelists, I think, and I want to echo and one of the things that Flori said, which is also perfectly aligned with some of the idea I wanted to share earlier. So as I mentioned, with Ambassador Leader Thomas Greenfield, we had a piece on from Wakanda to Reality, building mutual prosperity between African Americans and Africa. And area which are really important, of course, as you know, include really educational, recreational, and sustainable tourism. I think Flori has pointed out some of those, but Black people in the world, particularly in the US, I think have much to contribute in Africa. And only the tourist industry in 2015 was generated more than 39 billion and created more than 9.1 million of direct jobs. So this is phenomenal. It's a way to not just unlock business potential, but also generate sustainable growth. So of course, you have seen many of the African Americans who have traveled on the continent and which have each time created a wave, starting even with Martin Luther King, Maya Angelou, With the Oprah and you might know the Beyonce. So those waves are important and represent opportunity to be involved in the tourism industry among other. In the broader trade and investment, so a dimension which is also important is the number of billion-dollar companies that we have in Africa. When McKinsey last updated the number, we had over 400 companies of more than $100 billion value and more than 700 of more than $500 million value. So combined with, again, I spoke about the long-term trends in population growth, but even if we come at a closer period, only by 2030, Africa will have 1.7 billion people and a combined consumer and business spending of more than 6.7 trillion US dollars. So those are really important. And in the US, we have, of course, numbers are evolving. So, but when I last checked, about 2.6 million African American owned business, which could really partner with fellow African entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs to really do a deep dive in areas such as clothing. We have music, we mentioned the creative industry, food and beverage, and the art scene, among others. So those are really important areas. There are also areas which were identified by the African Continental Free Trade Area as key priorities. Those areas include agriculture and agri-processing. They include automotive. They include also areas such as transport and logistics. So key area for the future of trade and investment in Africa. And I finish with another area, which is the one related to really knowledge, technology sharing, and advancing US-Africa relation. When you think about doing business, countries are more likely to do business, or companies in a given country are more likely to do business with another country when they get along, when the two countries are getting along well. And that's why the work that you are doing, Carl, with BPIA, but the work that Flori is doing with CCA and many other, I think it's really a phenomenal work at putting issues and opportunities related to trade investment at the heart of conversation. I will stop there, but as you can see, I'm very excited that there's so much to be said there. But
I think we're all excited, Landry. Floyd, do you have just a few brief comments, and then I think we might want to
Actually,
turn it over to
I
the
have
audience.
a question. I hope this won't put Sean on the spot, but I was somewhere I was reading about how it became that the I think it's the Korean American community became the largest suppliers and owners of hair product stores. And I don't know about my, others here, but if you go in those places, a lot of those, so that value chain, I just wanted to ask about this, that particular value chain where they're selling products to African Americans, diaspora Africans, et cetera, they're making a lot of money in that sector. I wanted to ask Sean if he could share a little bit of his thinking about breaking into that value chain and, the kinds of work you've been doing in South Africa, because that seems like one where African Americans should be able to, break in, Africans should be able to break in. But in fact, that value chain is very much dominated, I guess that's the right word, by, I think, the Korean community.
Sean?
Yeah, so I think specifically for hair extensions sold in the US, that is the case. For hair extensions sold in South Africa, in the mass market, so your emerging middle class in South Africa, the majority of the value in the value chain is derived from a lot of your Indian South African communities and your Asian South African communities, primarily Chinese in South Africa. So that trend is actually the same, or very similar in South Africa, where your consumer, which is primarily Black people, are not necessarily involved in the rest of the value chain aside from buying the product. And then so that's what they call dry hair. So hair extensions, weaves, wigs, things like that are called dry hair. On the wet hair side, so your chemical relaxers, your shampoos, your conditioners, your treatments, those are primarily dominated by a couple of large multinationals. So L'Oreal and Henkel, I would say, are the two largest in South Africa. And then there's a very large Indian South African conglomerate as well that plays a major role. So again, the consumer is fairly Black South African. A lot of the value and economic value in the value chain, they're locked out of. So there is definitely a role to be played for both Black South Africans or the African diaspora widely, both here in South Africa and across the continent, and certainly in the US. A lot of it comes down to ability to access capital, because your people of the African diaspora are locked out of the capital that's needed to build an economy to scale in order to break in to these types of markets in a real way. We do have smaller players that are playing a role, but again, even if they have traction in the market in South Africa, still being able to raise the capital they need to build a manufacturing facility, to source raw materials, things of that nature, is still a challenge. So yeah, I do agree that there's a role to play, and there's a lot of value that Black people are left out of. And to me, the biggest issue is around just the ability to access capital.
John, Cal, can I make just one quick comment? That was very, I just wanted to say that the point that African Americans and Africans are large consumers and contribute a lot to, I'm not sure why.
You have an echo.
Yeah, I'm not sure why I have an echo, but I just was saying that we're large consumers.
Sean, I think, can you close your mic? Yeah.
Sorry. I don't know. I just was saying very quickly that we are large consumers, African Americans, Africans of various types of products. And it just seems to me that one area to explore for partnerships between African Americans and Africans are some of those particular value chains where we are huge consumers. I mean, really, incredible consumers, and contribute a lot to other groups who are benefiting. I'm not blaming them for benefiting, but I'm just saying we're contributing to them benefiting, and our own businesses and entrepreneurs and enterprises may not be benefiting. So I just think that's a natural start. That's one of them. And there are probably a number of others, but that was my only comment that I wanted to make based on what the others did. And Amina, I would love to introduce you to someone who is running a mining operation in Tanzania. They're an African-American woman, you may know her. But Pula is a member of CCA, Corporate Council on Africa, and they're in the mining sector there. And I'd love to connect you to her. So hopefully I'll get your information later.
Please.
Yeah,
sure.
And we'll hook up on that.
Yeah, we definitely would. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is great already. We're making connections. But I would like to turn over to the audience. Thank you so much to our panelists for really informative and illuminating discussions. We would like to give the opportunity to our very gracious audience. And so I will start with the question from Gail. She says, how much have limitations of the business and investment enabling environment had an impact on trade and investment? I think she's relating to, maybe if there's challenges in doing business in Africa. While large corporations can take the risks, political and business, SMEs cannot afford to. And therefore, you'd need good partners to vet out. I mean, you need help in vetting out good partners. The US has obviously better business bureaus, and there's a lot of infrastructure in that way. Are African governments and African Business Association addressing these challenges that affect trade and investment? Maybe this is something that Flori can address.
So this is an excellent question that Gail has, and you know, it's tough doing business, period. First of all, being a business owner, whether it's here in the US or in Africa, is there are certain challenges: access to capital, you know, access to the technology you may need. All of that is there. And SMEs do have, I think, more challenges in you know, than the larger multinationals. And so I think that here in the US, there are resources to help those who are trying to do business in Africa and are small. I know Exim Bank has a special section that focuses on SMEs and on women. I happen to be on the Sub-Saharan Africa Advisory Committee of Exim, but this is like work that Exim does, Exim Bank, the US Export-Import Bank, be formal, it does. SBA has programs that are helping people, small businesses. The Department of Commerce has work that it does to help smaller. They have the export assistance centers, EACs, that are spread all around the country, and they will help small businesses who are looking to get into other markets. They're not focused just on Africa, but you can go to an export assistance center of the Department of Commerce in probably in your city, if you're in Atlanta or Chicago or, you know, lots of areas, and get help. So I would stop there, but I think that there are organizations and institutions of the US government that will help to address some of the issues that Gail is mentioning.
Thank you so much, Lori. I think I'm going to go right ahead and go on to Jenny Manzanillo's question. She says, thank you very much. This has been very informational, which it has. Do panelists have any advice on the best market entry strategies to invest in African countries? So I would leave it up to any panelist that could provide an answer to Jenny.
So there are various ways. So the first and foremost thing is to do your homework. So I think the let's say cause number one of failure in doing business, and that is not just in Africa. I mean, even in the US, most corporations fail within the first 5 years of your creation. So it's to do the homework, to study the market, to engage, to build a sustained competitive advantage, and to map the Africa strategy in strategy to succeed in Africa by so some of the elements. Do you have clear aspiration? Do you set clear aspiration for growth? Do you prioritize the market that matter the most, or are you trying to go everywhere? Do you define clearly how you will scale? Because you may have an opportunity which could not be scaled and which may not be relevant over the long run, and how to build the ecosystem that you actually need to thrive. Do you have an innovative business model? Do you create products and services which are fulfilling Africa unmet needs? So that is another key dimension. Do you rethink how to engage with customer, how to reduce the cost for doing business, how to unleash African talent? Do you capitalize on the local human capital? And to what extent do you build new skills in area where more specific, let's say, competences are needed? And quite often people will also look for the advice of a lawyer when they're in serious trouble. I would say start there if possible. Like, have some resources which will prevent a high cost of managing conflict, and also think long-term in terms of resilience, think long-term in terms of portfolio, in terms of balancing, in terms of understanding how it is possible to engage with the government and partner with local players as well to really leapfrog, let's say, to learn or to reduce the cost of what you're not, so reduce the cost of the learning experiments so that you can be doing. So I think those are some of the dimensions, but I think probably Amina and Sean can also share more on those, on some of those questions. But do your homework and build a sustained competitive advantage, partner with government, engage with locals, have a lawyer before it is too late.
Those are excellent, excellent points. Thank you so much, Landry. There are many questions in the chat, and thank you so much for your contributions and your participation. Obviously, we're not going to get to every single question, but before I get to Bryant, who has put up his hand, there's one question that I think is very, very interesting, and this comes from Suli. He says, can a panelist talk about any cultural obstacles that businesses may encounter? And I think maybe Sean, maybe you might be somebody who can shed some light on that.
I can talk about that. I think that, so going back to my point about local partnerships, and I think it's something Landry brought up as well. I think it's incredibly important that you build relationships with locals, whether it's formal or informal. And there are many reasons why you want to do that. My perspective is that, especially for a business like mine, where we do a lot of work with government and communities, having someone who comes of those communities really helps to break down barriers, and it helps to help for people to know that you're coming from the right place, if you will, when you're trying to launch projects which are unique or new or different, and there's skepticism around what you're trying to do. And there are also, in a lot of these communities that we work in, there have been and continue to be initiatives that are supposed to have been launched, which don't happen, if you will. And that's not necessarily something that's a cultural thing, but it creates more skepticism. So being able to create a reputation amongst the local community where you are doing things by the book, you have their best interests at heart. It's incredibly important for building buy-in to your growth as a business. I think philosophically, coming from the U.S., I don't have any ties to South Africa at all, and so I as an entrepreneur, the ultimate goal is to make money. But you want to do it in a way that is fair to the country in which you're operating. At least that's the way I looked at it. And that's part of the reason why training was always key to what we built. Because yes, we charge for training, whether it's directly for the student or through government, but you're also getting an actual tangible result as after you finish the training. And that's something that especially in the vocational space, is really needed in a country like South Africa. And then also, I like living in South Africa, but when I look at the statistics around economic disparity in the country, I have to think to myself, okay, well, how sustainable is this? How sustainable is it where 90% of the country effectively is kind of locked out economically? And so if I, as an entrepreneur, am not doing anything in order to at least play my part in helping to drive economic value to the larger community, then, what am I really doing? What am I really accomplishing? I'm not ultimately helping move the society forward in a way that I think I can. And I hope that I have played a little bit of a role through my business and helping drive economic value and also educational value to the people that we interacted with.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Sean. That's really, really important. Brian, before I move to you, there is a specific question for Amina. We haven't heard a lot from her. Amina, Ivan Williamson would like to know, since you have an extensive web presence and you're active in organizations such as Association of African Women in Mining, can you discuss how making international alliances and contacts grows your business? And I realize that we've gone a little bit over time, so if you can just borrow, 2-3 more minutes of your time, I would really appreciate it. So Amina, if you can address that, and then Brian, and then we're going to unfortunately have to close this chat.
Okay, excuse me, let me do this quickly. So I think first of all, we have very deep rooted relationships, both locally, that's present in the country. And we've done so much work with the government. We're working on influencing policies and just making things better, developing things so that they're okay for our industry, right? So offering these services and building these relationships is actually helped us creating a foundation, I would say, to be able to stand on and reach out to people, to be able to do work with them. We do a lot of networking and we join organizations both locally and internationally. So for example, I'm on the board of advisory for the Black Injury Coalition, and that's in the US. So being part of these different organizations, we're affiliated with, we've done some work with other organizations in Asia, in Europe. So being affiliated with these organizations or partnering with them to do different things, it kind of like opens up our network, and that helps us be in the minds of people, I would say, so that when they're thinking about doing certain things, they reach out to us. Also, I would say, I think the professor has said this before, you have to educate yourself. And you have to do that in such a way that you're ready when the opportunity comes, because people are coming to you because you have value to offer. So that's something I want to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina, for that concise answer. And last but not least, Brian, I know I've been keeping you hanging. Can you please ask your question?
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Brian Eze Amama Agubalu. I'm an Igbo American. I want to touch on a couple of points about business between Africa and African Americans in the U.S. Business between Africa and African Americans is good for the economic survival, prosperity of Blacks and Africans, especially in this continuing global economic downturn. So I believe it's very important that we pursue it to the best of our ability. We need to promote African American DNA testing to deepen the connection between Africa and Black America.
Hi, Brian, we've lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, so also I came kind of late, so I don't know if you guys mentioned this, but there's something called Prosper Africa. I think that should be discussed. Just the website is prosperafrica.com. That's a great resource for doing business between Africa and the United States. Also, I want to mention that the U.S. is a more stable and reliable partner with more integrity than China and Russia. So that's another reason that it's very important to promote business between Africa and the United States. Again, my name is Brian Eze Amama Agubalu, and I'm gonna leave my contact if anybody wants to speak to me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian. I think one thing that you've raised is the importance of us actually trying to collect resources for you all to access easily on the BPI page. This is something that we want to commit ourselves to. This is something that we will put up on the page so that you can access some of these, Prosper Africa, Power Africa, AGOA, et cetera. I think these are all really important resources, especially as entrepreneurs doing business between the US and Africa. Now we've exceeded our webinar by 5 minutes. Thank you so much for your patience. And I really thank you for your participation. I think the activity in the chat just shows how much demand this programming has raised up and how much demand, this demand means that we have to do more of these. So thank you again for your support. We're going to have the next of the third of the 6-part webinar, which is going to be focused on African American and Caribbean enterprises. So we're moving to a place that is closer to the US, but nonetheless as important as any other Africans or Black people in the diaspora. So thank you so much again. And thank you definitely, especially to our panelists. Really enjoyed this very informative session, and we hope to have you again in future programs. Thank you again. Take care. Bye bye.
Let me just exercise my prerogative to say thank you to Landry, Flory, Sean, Amina. I really appreciate all of your presentations. And thank you for supporting BPIA by your participation today in this program. As Kolo said, we will have a 3rd program, and then we hope to finish over 6 programs over the next 2 years, over the course of this year and next year. So thank you very, very much again. I'm not sure if this can be done, but I'm more than willing to stay on if people have questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, John. I have a question about the Caribbean perspective. Has there been any opportunities to explore the Caribbean vis-a-vis Africa? I know that we're looking at how we can explore the relationship between African Americans or Black Americans in those regions, but is there any existing mechanisms where we're trying to center the relationship between the Caribbean and Africa writ large?
I would say yes. We're going to have the 3rd program on the Caribbean, but remember what unites these programs is the African heritage that we all share. So if we're sitting in America, we're sitting in the Caribbean or in Europe, for instance, we still look to Africa as our motherland, if I can say it that way. So certainly we will look at that. We will be planning our program. Please feel free to contact either myself or Kolo or Suli. And you're welcome to join our committee, because we only exist with your support and help and participation. So you're welcome. We welcome all of you to come and join us, contribute your ideas, suggestions, and we'll be glad to integrate them into our program.
Mhm. Christian, do you still have a question that you want to ask? Okay. We may have lost Christian.
Okay.
All right, I am going to sign off. It's dinner time for me. All right, thank you so much.
I think maybe we will all sign off. Thank you very much for your participation. I thank everyone for being here today. Look forward to our next program on the Caribbean. Thank you very much, and goodbye.